17. Black R&B legends who had secret same-sex relationships revealed. What if I told you some of the most iconic love songs in Black R&B history were sung by people who couldn't safely live their own love in public? While the world applauded the voice, the suits, the swagger many legends were hiding, relationships that could have ended their careers overnight. Not rumors, real lives shaped by fear, faith, fame, and survival. Today, on Legends of Black Excellence, we're opening doors that were locked for decades. Stay with me to the end because the final story might change how you hear these classics forever. And if this matters to you, hit like, subscribe, and comment should these truths be celebrated or left private. Big Mama Thornton. Willie Mae. Big Mama Thornton lived in a time when the spotlight could be both a blessing and a trap. Long before the world learned to talk openly about identity, many black artists had to split themselves in two, one life for the stage, another for the heart. Big Mama was a master of that balancing act. To audiences, she was thunder in human form, bold, loud, commanding, and proudly outside the box that society tried to force around black women. Her breakthrough came in 1952 with Hound Dog, a record that didn't just succeed, it helped shape the sound of modern American music. Big Mama's version hit hard with grit humor and raw desire, selling massively in the R&B market and sitting at the top of the charts for weeks. Yet the industry around her was still built to reward others more than the woman who created the fire. She kept touring, kept recording, and kept delivering performances so intense they felt like a storm rolling through the room. On stage, Thornton's Big Daddy style was unmistakable. Men's suits, a cigar, a swagger that didn't ask permission. That image wasn't a costume, it was a declaration of who she was. But in the era she came up in, a public confession of same-sex love could destroy everything she'd built. So the world saw the powerhouse, while the private woman stayed protected behind closed doors. Only after her death in 1984 did people close to her begin speaking more freely. Friends and co-workers described Thornton as having quiet, romantic relationships with women. Deep connections formed on the road and backstage kept safely under the label of colleagues. Whether those love stories were brief or lasting, they were real enough to the people who witnessed them and hidden enough to survive. Big Mama Thornton's legacy isn't about scandal. It's about endurance, a trailblazer who sang truth into a microphone while guarding her own truth in the dark, so the music and her life could keep going. Frankie Beverly. Frankie Beverly walked into the spotlight as the very definition of Philly soul, smooth, steady, and built for the long haul. With Maze, he delivered songs that didn't just climb charts. They became family traditions. Before I Let Go and Joy and Pain weren't only hits, they were life soundtracks played at cookouts, weddings, reunions, and any night where people needed to feel each other again. On stage, Frankie carried the image of a romantic leading man, the voice of devotion and grown folks' love that audiences trusted for more than half a century. But the video says that behind that beloved public persona was a story told only in whispers. According to crew members dating back to the late 1960s, Frankie shared an unusually deep bond with Robert Butch, his longtime sound manager. They weren't just co-workers passing through the same gigs. Insiders said Butch was always at Frankie's side, city after city, tour after tour, eating together, traveling together, moving like two people whose lives were fully intertwined. By the 1970s and 1980s, rumors circulated quietly in music circles, especially after private industry parties, where people noticed how inseparable the two men seemed. Still, nothing was ever publicly confirmed. The video goes further, describing how the relationship, if you believe those who were close to them, lasted more than 40 years. It claims they lived together first in Germantown and later in Oakland. And whenever anyone asked questions, Frankie would just smile and say they were cousins. In a time when a black male R&B star's career depended on being seen as the man behind love songs for women, that answer protected everything: the music, the brand, the livelihood, and the private life he wasn't free to name. Only after Butch passed away in 2016 did old stories start resurfacing more openly. Then, when Frankie finally retired in 2024, the whispers grew louder, less like gossip, and more like a long-sealed chapter being gently reopened. The video's point isn't to tear down the legend. It's to show the cost of the era he lived in a man who gave the world timeless love songs while keeping his own love safely out of sight. Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Sister Rosetta Tharpe is introduced in the video as the true godmother of rock and roll, a woman who didn't just sing gospel, she electrified it. With her blazing guitar work and a voice that could shout tease and testify, all in the same breath, she broke the rules of sacred music long before rock had a name. The video paints her as a trailblazer who carried church fire into nightclubs, reshaping American sound while standing in the middle of heavy social expectations. According to the story told in the video, everything changed in 1947 during a performance in Harlem, when Rosetta met a young, charismatic gospel singer named Marie Knight. They quickly became a powerful duo on the road. The video says that as they toured across the country, people in the music world whispered that their bond went far beyond professional partnership. For about 7 years, they reportedly lived under the same roof in Harlem, rehearsing, writing, and performing side by side, two stars, sharing not just a stage, but a life that couldn't be named out loud. The video stresses why it had to stay secret. Rosetta was celebrated as a church icon, a missionary figure to the public. In the late 1940s, being open about same-sex love, especially as a black gospel superstar, could have meant losing everything: her audience, her career, her place in the religious world that both made and policed her. So, whatever love existed had to live backstage in late-night conversations and in the spaces where LGBTQ+ listeners could breathe freely, while the public story remained strictly safe. By 1951, the partnership ended, the video says, under the weight of fame and the era's prejudice. But time has a way of pulling truths back into the light. Years later, researchers and those close to the scene pointed to letters, documents, and historical accounts that suggested their relationship was deeper than what the headlines ever allowed. The video's takeaway is simple and bittersweet. Rosetta Tharpe helped invent rock's spirit of freedom, even while her own freedom, especially in love, had to be hidden in plain sight. Patrice Rushen. Patrice Rushen is presented in the video as one of the defining R&B voices and musical brains of the 1980s, a gifted singer-keyboardist and composer whose sound felt polished but never cold. The narrator centers her breakthrough around Forget Me Nots, the sleek, instantly recognizable hit that turned her into a Los Angeles music icon and later became a staple in pop culture through countless samples and throwbacks. On stage and in public, Patrice carried the image the industry wanted: glamorous, confident, and clearly framed for a mainstream audience that expected black female R&B stars to be straight sexy and male-oriented. But the video says that behind that carefully maintained spotlight image was a quieter reality the public wasn't allowed to see. According to people in her circle, Patrice had a close private relationship that stretched nearly a decade with a young dancer named Linda. The two reportedly grew close in the late 1970s and were often seen together at rehearsals, tours, and black artist community events, moving with the ease of two people who belonged to each other when cameras weren't rolling. The video describes their offstage time as the only place where Patrice could truly relax into herself, away from the pressure to perform a hetero fantasy. As the story goes, the bond was an open secret to some insiders, but never spoken aloud in public. Midway through the 1980s, rumors flared harder, fueled by sightings at industry parties and the way the two women seemed inseparable. The narrator frames this as the moment Patrice faced a brutal choice: protect her career or risk everything by telling the truth in an era that punished women for loving women. In that climate, silence wasn't just personal, it was survival. The video adds that by around 1987, when tabloids and sensational headlines started circling, people in the business assumed Patrice married a male colleague to shut down speculation. Whether that decision was real strategy or just industry rumor, the video emphasizes one thing: Patrice never confirmed or denied what she felt. and her inner life stayed guarded. The result is a portrait of an artist whose music radiated freedom, while her own freedom in love had to remain carefully hidden behind the glow of fame. Luther Vandross. Luther Vandross is framed in the video as the golden voice of soul and R&B, the man who could turn romance into something almost sacred. From the late 1970s onward, his music defined grown folks' love, smooth, elegant, and irresistible. Songs like Never Too Much didn't just make him a star. They made him the emotional soundtrack for millions of women who saw him as the perfect romantic leading man. On stage, Luther was polished and tender, always delivering affection in every note. But the video says that behind that flawless public image, Luther carried a private life he guarded with extreme care. According to people close to him, a deep, quiet relationship began around 1978 with a man named Jimmy, a stylist who became Luther's constant presence from the earliest days of his rise. The narrator describes Jimmy not as a casual figure in Luther's orbit, but as someone woven into his everyday world, touring with him, appearing backstage for years, and by insider accounts, sharing a home with him in Connecticut for nearly 2 decades. In the video's telling, their bond was understood by many within the inner circle, but never placed in the open light. The reason the video argues was simple and heartbreaking. Luther knew exactly what the industry was selling. He was marketed as the dream man, the singer of yearning ballads meant to make women feel adored. In an era when a male R&B superstar could lose radio support endorsements and mainstream acceptance overnight, being honest about same-sex love felt too dangerous. So Luther chose silence. The video paints that silence not as shame, but as survival, a shield built from fear of losing everything he'd worked for. Only after Luther's death in 2005 did the conversation grow louder. The video notes that friends and longtime collaborators began gently sharing what had been kept private, suggesting Jimmy was far more than a stylist. He was a companion, possibly the great love of Luther's adult life. At the same time, the narrator acknowledges that Luther's family reportedly denied the relationship, keeping the public record complicated. The video's final tone is bittersweet. Luther gave the world some of the most beautiful love songs ever written, while living with a love that, if the story is true, he couldn't safely name out loud until after he was gone. Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy Pendergrass is remembered in the video as one of Philly soul's most magnetic stars, the voice that turned bedroom slow jams into an era. With classics like Close the Door and Turn Off the Lights, he projected pure grown man romance, confident, seductive, and built for the spotlight. In the 1970s and early 80s, Teddy's image was carefully polished into the ultimate ladies' man, the kind of singer whose concerts felt like a direct invitation to desire. Publicly, everything about him was strength, heat, and control. But the video says there was another side of Teddy's life that stayed off stage. Starting around 1975, when he was rising with Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, and then as a solo star, insiders noticed a bond between Teddy and a stage manager named Lee. The narrator frames it as more than professional loyalty. Lee was always close, always present, and deeply trusted. In an industry where entourages rotate and people come and go, Lee's constancy stood out. To those around them, their connection felt unusually personal, yet it remained unspoken in public. Then came the night that changed everything: Teddy's 1982 car crash in Philadelphia. He was driving a Rolls-Royce when the car slammed into trees, leaving him paralyzed from the chest down. The passenger was Tenica Watson, a transgender nightclub performer. The media exploded with speculation about what her presence meant for Teddy's private life. Here's the important truth: Tenica survived the crash. But the shock of the accident, combined with the era's prejudice toward transgender people, fed rumor mills for years, and the video highlights how that scrutiny followed Teddy even while he fought to rebuild his career. Through it all, Teddy never confirmed or denied any claims about his sexuality or his relationship with Lee. The video suggests that in private LGBTQ+ artist spaces during the 1980s, Teddy and Lee were seen together in ways that fueled the belief they were more than friends. And only after Teddy's death in 2010 did some acquaintances from the Philly soul world speak more openly, describing Lee not simply as a manager or close friend, but as a companion whose role in Teddy's life was deeper than the public ever knew. The story lands as both tragic and tender, a man who sang fearless passion to millions while guarding his own heart behind the curtain. Johnny Mathis. Johnny Mathis is portrayed in the video as one of America's great romantic voices, the velvet smooth crooner behind timeless ballads like Misty and Chances Are. For decades, his gentle delivery and polished stage presence made him a symbol of classic old-school love, an artist whose music seemed designed for candlelight slow dances and late-night radio. To the public, he was the soft-spoken dream man, steady and elegant from the 1950s, all the way through the 1990s. But the video says that behind those stage lights, Mathis carried a private life he rarely let the world see. According to the narrative, during his Las Vegas touring years in 1958, he met a male singer and backup dancer named George. The relationship, the video claims, lasted about 10 years, yet had to be kept hidden, with George introduced publicly only as a colleague. The pressures of the era, especially for a black star marketed as a romantic idol, meant even a whisper could threaten everything. After that first love ended, the video continues. Mathis began another long secret relationship in 1972 with a man named Mitch, described as a financial director. It says they lived together for roughly 23 years, shared a home life away from public view, and traveled together while Mathis consistently dodged personal questions. In the early 1980s, he reportedly hinted at his sexuality, then quickly pulled back to protect his career and fan base. What is firmly on record is that Mathis later acknowledged being gay, reflecting on the risks he faced at the height of his fame. The video frames his story as a quiet, lifelong effort to balance love and survival, an artist who sang openly about romance for millions while keeping his own heart carefully out of sight until the world was finally ready to hear it. Ruth Brown. Ruth Brown is introduced in the video as the unstoppable queen of R&B, the woman whose voice practically built Atlantic Records in the 1950s. She wasn't just a hitmaker, she was the engine. With songs like Teardrops from My Eyes and Mama He Treats Your Daughter, Mean Ruth helped define early black pop R&B and opened doors for generations of singers who came after her. On stage, she radiated confidence and charm, the kind of star who sounded like she was smiling straight through the microphone. Then the video shifts to the private life the public never got to see. It says that after a painful betrayal, falling for a married man and being left crushed, Ruth began to turn away from men emotionally and open herself to women. In a world where a black female entertainer was expected to be a straight, glamorous symbol of desire, that kind of choice couldn't be spoken out loud. So whatever she felt had to remain behind closed doors. The narrator points to one relationship in particular, a 5-year, reportedly intense bond with Blanche Calloway, the younger sister of Cab Calloway and Ruth's manager. The video describes Blanche as more than a career guide, someone who helped Ruth secure key opportunities, traveled with her, and supposedly shared her life in hotel rooms and apartments, while the outside world only saw business partners. The storytelling suggests Ruth's songs from that era carried hidden messages, love notes disguised as lyrics. But the era Ruth lived in didn't leave room for honesty without punishment. The video says she never publicly confirmed these relationships and instead moved through short marriages that seemed less like true sanctuary and more like cover in a harsh spotlight. Only after Ruth's death in 2006, the narrator adds, did friends and LGBTQ+ history circles speak more openly about this hidden chapter. The takeaway is less about shock and more about cost, a woman who sang love so boldly for the world while being forced to keep her own love unnamed. Dinah Washington. Dinah Washington is presented in the video as America's Queen of Blues, a woman whose voice could turn heartbreak into elegance and power. With signature hits like What a Difference a Day Makes, she stood at the center of black popular music in the 1950s, glamorous, fiery, and endlessly in demand. To the public, Dinah was the image of a magnetic, seductive star, the kind of woman who seemed born to be desired and admired. But the video says her private world carried secrets that couldn't survive in daylight. Around 1955, Dinah reportedly began a relationship with a woman named LaRue, or LaRue, described as her personal assistant. What started as a working bond, the narrator claims, grew into a deep love. The two supposedly lived together in Detroit and New York, moving through the same homes and hotel rooms, while Dinah's fame grew louder outside their door. The video adds a romantic detail. They exchanged hundreds of love letters, words that only existed safely on paper, not in public speech. That secrecy, the video explains, wasn't optional. In that era, a black female blues and jazz star was boxed into a straight fantasy for audiences and promoters. So Dinah kept her relationship hidden, and according to the narrator, entered multiple marriages with men, partly to distract the press and protect her career. The video frames those marriages not as proof of a single identity, but as survival tactics in a world where truth could end everything. The story turns tragic in the final act. Dinah Washington died in 1963 from an overdose of sleeping pills, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance and turbulence. The video says it wasn't until a 1987 biography, Queen of the Blues, that her relationship with LaRue was described publicly, confirming her place in history as a bisexual icon despite her family's denials. The takeaway is bittersweet. Dinah spent her life singing love with fearless intensity while living a love she had to keep locked away, waiting for a future that might understand her better than her own time ever could. Billy Preston. Billy Preston is introduced in the video as the brilliant keyboard prodigy who could slide effortlessly between sacred gospel roots and the biggest stages in pop and rock. Known to many fans as the fifth Beatle, he became a musical bridge between Black R&B and the wider world, playing with legends like Ray Charles Sly and the Family Stone and the Rolling Stones. On records and on tour, Preston's sound felt joyful and uplifting, like church energy translated into stadium lights. The video leans into the tension behind that smile. It says, Billy grew up under strict religious expectations and a painful childhood that trained him to hide parts of himself early. In the public eye, he was a lovable superstar, but privately he was wrestling with identity in a time when a black male artist could lose everything if he was seen as anything outside the acceptable image. According to the narrator, that pressure followed him into adulthood, even as his talent opened doors most musicians only dreamed of. The transcript then describes his first same-sex love as a fellow keyboard player in Ray Charles's band, something that brought him brief happiness while he was still moving through the early grind of touring life. But the relationship didn't last. By around 1978, the video claims Billy entered a longer, more serious relationship with a man named Tony, who stayed beside him through some of his darkest years. The story frames Tony not as a passing romance, but as a steady companion through addiction, volatility, and the isolation that fame can bring. The video closes Billy's chapter on a bittersweet note. Despite the success, he struggled with drugs and inner turmoil for years and died in 2006 from complications tied to kidney failure. Only after his passing, the narrator says, did pieces of his private love life surface through documentaries and the memories of people who knew him. Whether every detail can be fully verified or not, the larger truth stands. Billy Preston's life reflected a generation of black music icons who gave the world joy while often being denied the freedom to live theirs openly. Escarita Esque Reader Jr. Escarita is painted in the video as one of rock and roll's wildest early originals, flashy, fearless, and decades ahead of his time. Born Esque Reader Jr., he was a flamboyant piano hurricane who mixed gospel speed, blues grit, and stage glitter into a sound that could light up any room. The narrator calls him a pioneer not just for his music, but for the way he performed makeup, theatrical outfits, and a swagger that openly blurred the lines of gender and desire in an era that punished anyone who did. The video places Escarita right at the root of Little Richard's story. According to the narrator, Escarita wasn't only a fellow musician, he was Richard's piano teacher and early guide into the electrified queer nightlife where rock was being born. Their connection, the video says, began around 1955 and lasted in some form until 1986. They lived together in Atlanta for a period, rehearsed side by side, and shared a creative chemistry that went beyond ordinary friendship. The narrator suggests their bond carried romance as well as mentorship, a passionate love of youth kept invisible to the mainstream. Inside the video's telling, Escarita helped shape key parts of Richard's persona. He passed on performance tricks, piano patterns, and the secrets of building a larger-than-life image for club stages. Their relationship unfolded in a world where queer artists could be fully themselves at night, but had to mask it by day. Once Richard's fame surged, the split became inevitable. The video frames that separation as a heartbreak hidden behind career success. Escarita remained in the shadows, while Richard became a global star. After their breakup, the video says Escarita continued having relationships with other men within the queer community, keeping his romantic life private, even as his artistry stayed unapologetically loud. He never became a household name, but he kept performing, mentoring, and living within the underground world that had always embraced him. Escarita died in 1986 from complications related to AIDS, and the video notes that it was only after his death that fuller details of his love life, especially his long, complicated bond with Little Richard, began to surface through memoirs and the memories of people who knew the real story. The narrator's final point is clear. Escarita wasn't a footnote. He was one of the hidden architects of rock, and his secret love story is part of the DNA of the music we celebrate today. Carl Bean. Carl Bean is introduced in the video as a groundbreaking figure in Black LGBTQ+ history, a gospel-trained singer who stepped into the microphone and said what so many were forbidden to say. The narrator highlights his 1977 anthem, "I Was Born This Way," framing it not only as a song but as a declaration of existence at a time when being openly gay could end a career, a ministry, or even a life. Carl's voice carried both church power and personal truth, and the video presents him as someone who quietly helped open a new door for acceptance inside Black music and faith communities. But even as Carl became a symbol of liberation, the video says his deepest love lived in secrecy for decades. In 1968, at a private gathering for the Black gay community in Greenwich Village, New York, Carl met Clarence, a Haitian-born stage actor. The narrator describes that moment as the start of a love story that would reshape Carl's life. Clarence wasn't a passing romance. He became the great love of Carl Bean's world, the one person who saw him fully and stayed beside him through every era that followed. According to the video, the two men built a quiet home together in Los Angeles. Clarence was not only Carl's partner in life, but also his emotional anchor, and the relationship grew in the background while Carl's public image remained carefully protected. The narrator says Carl often introduced Clarence simply as a close friend, a label that allowed them to stay safe in a society that would have punished them both. Their love, however, was steady enough to inspire Carl's music, including the spirit behind "I Was Born This Way," which the video connects to Carl living the truth, even when he couldn't fully name it in public. The video adds one especially tender detail. In 1985, after more than a decade together, Carl and Clarence exchanged rings in a small private commitment ceremony with only 6 friends present. It was their way of affirming loyalty when the world still didn't offer them legal or public recognition. That bond lasted nearly 40 years, the narrator says, and it was only after Clarence passed away in 2008 that Carl felt free enough to share the full story. The takeaway is deeply moving. A man who became a public beacon for queer freedom still had to guard his own love in silence until time finally allowed it to be spoken. Labi Sifra. Labi Siffre enters the video as a quiet giant and artist whose music carries both tenderness and backbone. He's best known for the civil rights-leaning anthem Something Inside. So strong a song that feels like a sermon and a protest at once. The video frames him as an LGBTQ+ icon whose work resonated deeply with Black audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, even though he often stood a little outside the American R&B spotlight. His voice, the narrator suggests, belonged to the same lineage of soul truth-tellers who turned pain into something survivable. The story then pivots to love specifically, a love that lasted longer than most careers. The video says that while Labi was openly gay among people close to him, he still protected his partner from fame's glare. He met Peter John Carver Lloyd in the mid-1960s, and they built a life together almost immediately. Peter, as the narrator tells it, wanted no part of celebrity culture. He stayed out of photographs, avoided interviews, and chose a life in the background even as Labi's songs traveled the world. That privacy was not about shame. It was about safety, peace, and respecting the kind of love that didn't need an audience. One important accuracy note for your script reliable public records show: Labi met Peter in 1964. They were together for about 48 years, and Peter passed away in 2013, not 2021. The 56 years figure in the video is emotionally framed, but doesn't match documented timelines. What is true and matches the spirit of the video is that their relationship was long devoted and largely hidden from the public for decades. Labi chose love over headlines, and Peter chose quiet over fame. The video's final beat is bittersweet. After Peter's death, Labi began speaking more openly about the depth of that bond, finally attaching a name and a face to the man who had been his home for most of his adult life. In the context of 17 Black R&B legends who had secret same-sex relationships revealed, Labi's chapter underscores a central theme. Even artists who lived truthfully still had to protect the people they loved, because the world wasn't always safe enough to let that love stand in the light. Sylvester. Sylvester is remembered in the video as the king of disco, the glittering falsetto who made freedom sound like a four-on-the-floor heartbeat. With anthems like You Make Me Feel Mighty Real and Dance Disco Heat, he didn't just fill dance floors, he turned them into safe havens, especially for Black and gay audiences who finally saw themselves reflected in the music. On stage, Sylvester was fearless, high fashion, high emotion, and a voice that felt like pure release. The video says his greatest love story began in 1974 when he met Patrick Cowley, a gifted keyboardist and producer in San Francisco's Castro scene. Their bond is described as both romantic and creative. Patrick wasn't just behind the boards, he was portrayed as Sylvester's partner in life, and in sound, the person who helped shape that futuristic soaring disco style. In the video's telling, they lived together, built music together, and quietly protected their relationship from a public world that still wasn't safe. To keep this story grounded in verified history, Patrick Cowley's life was tragically short. He became seriously ill in the early 1980s and passed away in 1982, not 1987. What remains true and deeply important is how central Cowley was to Sylvester's musical universe and to the gay Black disco culture that birthed their work. Their connection belonged to a moment when love, art, and survival were woven tightly together. Sylvester's later years were marked by the devastation of the AIDS crisis. He lost people he loved, and he himself died in 1988 from AIDS-related complications. The heartbreak the video reaches for is real. This era stole partners, friends, and futures from countless artists, and many of those love stories were never spoken aloud until much later. Modern documentaries and retrospectives have helped bring Sylvester's private world into clearer view, not to scandalize him, but to honor the depth behind the sparkle, a man who gave the world joy while loving through one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Frankie Knuckles. Frankie Knuckles is framed in the video as the father of house music, the soft-spoken genius who helped turn Chicago's underground dance floors into a global movement. Coming out of the late 70s disco scene, Frankie became the heartbeat of the Warehouse Club in Chicago, where his edits and marathon sets helped shape what people soon called house. The music he championed wasn't just a new sound, it was a refuge, especially for Black and LGBTQ+ communities, who built joy and family in the dark when the outside world wouldn't make room for them. Then the video steps away from his public legacy and into the love story. It says he kept quiet. According to the narrator, Frankie met a lighting designer named Eric Warner at the Warehouse in 1984. What began in the same room where House was being born reportedly became a relationship that lasted around 30 years. The video describes them as living together in Chicago's Boys Town neighborhood, sharing a daily life that was steady and domestic even while Frankie's nights belonged to the world. The key point the video stresses is how carefully Frankie protected that relationship. While he was openly gay within the culture that raised him, he supposedly never revealed Eric's identity publicly, not out of shame, but out of love and caution, because spotlight can burn the people closest to you. The narrator adds that in 1994, they held a private engagement ceremony on a beach in Puerto Rico, a quiet vow between two men when legal recognition and public acceptance still weren't guaranteed. After Frankie died in March 2014, the video says the story stayed mostly sealed until 2020, when Eric finally spoke about their life together as a tribute to Frankie's memory. Whether every detail is preserved in public records or not, the emotional truth the video wants you to feel is clear behind the legend. Who gave the world a soundtrack for liberation was a private, lasting love protected for decades in the same spirit of care, loyalty, and survival that shaped the music itself. Tracy Chapman. Tracy Chapman is presented in the video as the quiet storm of folk soul, an artist whose voice carried working-class truth into the mainstream. With Fast Car and Give Me One Reason, she became one of the most recognizable storytellers of the late 1980s and 1990s, yet she stayed intensely private, rarely giving the public more than the music. The video frames her as someone who never chased celebrity for its own sake, which made her personal life even more sealed off from view. According to the narration, a hidden love chapter began in 1996 at a fundraiser for Black women in Berkeley, California. That night, Tracy met Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Alice Walker. The video describes an instant connection that moved from admiration into romance. It emphasizes how quietly it all happened. No red carpets, no headlines, no public statements. Just two gifted Black women finding each other in a world that still made same-sex love, especially for famous Black artists, a risky thing to name aloud. The relationship, the video says, unfolded in a gentle domestic rhythm far from the spotlight. Tracy and Alice reportedly lived together in Minnesota for years, building a peaceful home life. Alice is portrayed as Tracy's first listener, hearing early demos, offering feedback, and helping shape songs behind the scenes. But even in private, Alice was described as extremely shy about fame, avoiding cameras and public events, sometimes keeping to the edges of gatherings, so Tracy could have her moment without dragging their relationship into view. By 2007, the video says they separated, not because love had vanished, but because their lives started pulling in different directions. Tracy became more outward-facing and active, while Alice retreated further inward. Friends later spoke about how meaningful the relationship had been, and by the late 2010s, the story became more widely known through people close to them. The video's point is less about gossip and more about context. Even in a newer era, two celebrated Black artists chose privacy as protection, letting the music speak while their love stayed quietly their own. From Big Mama Thornton's hidden romances to Tracy Chapman's quiet decade of love, these stories reveal a truth rarely spoken aloud. Some of the greatest voices in Black music lived in a world that celebrated their talent but denied their freedom to love. Behind legendary hits, world tours, and cultural revolutions were private battles for safety, dignity, and authenticity. These artists shaped American music while carrying secrets society refused to understand. Now that their stories have surfaced, one question remains for all of us on Legends of Black Excellence. Does knowing the truth change how we honor their legacy or deepen it?